Good morning. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tanya, and congratulations. So I have 50 minutes to talk about probably 50 years of social psychology, so bear with me. It will be a lot. I'll talk about the psychology of change. I wasn't really sure how to address this topic, and I said, well, I think let's talk about change, both for good and for bad. And how do we deal with that as human beings? My name is Patrycja Slawuta, and I wear many hats. My very first hat was a researcher, psychologist, behavioral scientist. I had the privilege of work and be trained by some of the best in the field of social psychology. Became an entrepreneur. As you know, as entrepreneurship has ups and downs. Some companies got sold, some companies failed. The latest one is called SelfHackathon. And it's really a company that does mind hacking. And what I mean by mind hacking is really bringing in a lot of my friends who are in academia, mostly scientists, neuroscientists, data nerds, and really looking at that very interesting intersection between psychology, technology, accelerating technology, and innovation, both business and personal innovation. And so who we are, we're mostly psychologists. There's so much depth of knowledge locked in psychological papers, both psychology, social psychology, sociology. We are facing a crisis of humanity overall. How do we deal with ourselves? How do we deal in the changing world? What's going on when the tribes start forming again between us and them, and we're better than that they are? We also neuroscientists. We look into the human brain and we see what's happening there. What are we hardwired to do as human beings? And we data nerds, because data is accelerating. We're getting more and more data. It's being used for good and it's being used for bad. So we're trying to figure out, what are the solutions. And so the field that we play in is the field that we call psych tech, which is the intersection between psychology and technology. And we have, over the years, we have created a particular framework that we like to work with. And I want to share that framework with you before I move on, because I think that will frame everything else that I will talk about. And there are three major principles. The first principle is, we mine for many things. We mine for resources. Some people are trying to mine also asteroids and moon and even further. We believe actually that there's another natural resource that's completely untapped and very precious, and it's between our ears. It's the 20 centimeters between our ears, and it's, we have not been tapping well into that resource, so hopefully today we'll work on that. The second premise is that a lot of us, and we do a lot of work in the United States in Silicon Valley, work with some of the top companies that many of you know, and they all get excited about the newest algorithm and this and that and AI, which I think is extremely exciting. But when you actually look where AI is heading, when you look where technology is heading, it's moving from mechanic into bionic. It's moving into organic. And the most sophisticated code that we see so far, and we'll probably see for a long time, is the human code, because it's a living code. When you look at your brain, when you look at the neurons, when you look at your DNA, it literally codes and recodes itself in real time. Talk to any AI specialist and they would say that's the ultimate where we want to take AI. We want to make AI respond live to whatever impulse is coming. And that's, a little baby does that. And so we talk about wetware, the human mind being as wetware. And finally, we also believe that pretty much any skill is hackable, learnable, and upgradable. Pretty much any skill you want to learn, both business-wise and personal-wise. And so we talk about the human OS, and the take-home message from my short presentation today is, in order to actually hack change, in order to understand change, in order to take a human being on a change, you have to take the entire human being. And when you think about the human OS, and we talk about computer OS, human beings also run on an OS. And I'll take the next 11 minutes to kind of walk you through the human OS and why it's important to understand all parts of that human OS. And we kind of dumb down the neuroscience, the psychology, even for ourselves, into 4 parts. And we believe that when you think about humans and how we interact and how we function, how we get programmed, there are 4 parts that program us. The first one is the head, and it's the 70,000 thoughts that we have in our head, assumptions and all that kind of stuff. Then there's the heart. It's the emotional center of the body. And in fact, when you look at the social psychology, it is what drives the show. It is the emotions. Then we have the body, which is our hardware, which is there's nobody, there's no us, not until we get uploaded into the cloud. And then finally, it's other people that very, very strongly program us. And so one interesting thing is, one human being is very complex, and then take those human beings and put them into this building, let's say, and you get corporate. And corporates also have OS. And I think one of the interesting things to keep in mind is in order to facilitate organizational change or in general systemic change, we have to turn the organization that's very mechanistic into an organism. And that's the process that we've been seeing with companies that are making really radical shifts. It's really, you're not a cog in a machine. The people are not cogs in a machine, and there's this big machine that's supposed to, you push and pull levers, and then it functions or doesn't. It is, when you look at the world, it is an organism that does not necessarily have one leader, and the leader's going to fluctuate. It's the swarm mentality that we see that actually works the best. And so when you look about the corporate OS, you can start mapping it up into the human form. And it starts with the head, which is the strategy, goes into the heart, which is the culture, how companies make us feel. How do we feel inside our company? It is the body, that is the tactics, right? The tactics, the things that the company does. And finally, it's the people, which is the human dynamics. And so I have 8.5 minutes left. But the question is, are you ready to explore that a little bit? Who's ready? OK, so turn around to your neighbor and give them a high five and introduce themselves.
I'm Ross. Great, Paul. Not too bad. Oh, of course. We've been involved with organising this, so it's kind of cool to sit back here and just
OK.
They are really quite incredible. Have you done many of these sorts of things?
Shh. I used to teach in school, and that's exactly what I would get to. So let's get started. In the head, the human head, the corporate head, you have the psychological OS, and it's the software. It is the 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections, and 7,000 thoughts that we have a day. It is also the assumptions we have about ourselves, which are actually very important, assumptions we have about others, assumptions we have about future. We have biases, about 200 biases that psychologists have indicated. You go into Wikipedia and see how many biases we have. We're just walking bias machine. And then we have expectations. How should I behave? How should she behave? How should we behave in a social environment? Are we allowed to talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the corporate head, which is the strategy, right? The things that corporate does. And I think one interesting thing about change is the future. And this is research that is done by Daniel Schachter at Harvard, who's actually looking into the brain and memories. And he's one of the biggest researchers when it comes to memory. And he says, when you look at the human brain, and when this human brain starts simulating future, it actually looks at all the past and projects past into the future. In other words, it's very, very hard to imagine future that's different than the past. We're just not hardwired to do that. So what Peter was talking about, possible futures, it's very hard for us as human beings to imagine different futures than what has been. And so when you actually look at the most powerful leaders in the past, they say imagine, and they say I have a dream. And they say, and they're able to paint a picture that's so compelling into the future that is not a continuation of the past, and say, this is where we're going. So that's the difference between remember future, which is what we naturally do, versus imagine future. And the imagined future has to be so compelling and has such a gravitational force that we all decide to rally behind it and walk over there. Then we have the heart, right? When we talk about the human OS or corporate OS, we have the heart. It's the emotional OS. And from my perspective, by background, I'm a genocide researcher. I studied genocidal propaganda. What are the things that lead us to do things that we regret? Most of us regret afterwards. So I look at most of the major genocide in 20th century, and it wasn't the rational. It was the heart that led people. It was the hatred. It was fear. A lot of fear was discussed about another human being. And so you probably know the research by Kahneman and Tversky between System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the hot system. It's the emotional system. It's the one that drives the show. And then the System 2, which is the more rational one that leads through neurocortex, is the more calculated one. In corporate, we talk about the culture. And so my hack, in some way, to deal with emotions, first of all, is acknowledge them. And I think just as we want to acknowledge all the positive emotions, I think we have to acknowledge the negative ones. And the very first step of working with those negative emotions, they're so strong. When you look at the primary emotions, most of them, 4 out of 5, are actually negative. And so in some way, they drive the show. Step number 1 is actually to name them. There's all kinds of research coming from neuroscientists who say, when you get out of control and the emotions are so strong and they seem to kind of rule the business, naming the emotion and saying, I feel X, or this is what's in the room, kind of tames the emotion. So we talk about name it to tame it. And if any of you have studied Zen Buddhism, there's probably one of the oldest stories, I think it's called the ox. And it's a story of this guy, and then suddenly the ox appears, and it turns out the ox is his kind of the darker side. And he's trying to pull the ox and kick the ox, and the ox does whatever it wants, because an ox is much more powerful than a human being. And ultimately, we'll see in the whole story, he jumps on the ox, and he learns to ride the ox. And then he starts at square one. He goes back to the village. It is about respecting those emotions, especially those dark ones. And I would say the one that we actually have to respect the most, and we see that coming, is fear. Because fear, by far, we all hear, because your predecessor either got angry and fought somebody, or got afraid and ran away. And so those are the 2 emotions that we actually have to respect. And if unrespected, they turn into this big ox that we just cannot fight. And then finally, it's explore. It's really exploring the emotions. And as a psychologist, I can tell you that the spectrum of human experience is so fascinating, and the emotions are so rich. And I strongly invite you to kind of start exploring them. Then we have the body. And the body is the hardware, right? It's the hardware that carries in the software and everything else. Before, hopefully that day when we can upload ourselves into a cloud comes, but right now, you are bounded to this body. And if the body goes, all your software and all your dreams and aspirations probably go as well. And so it's also the primary communication tool. Besides communicating with our language, we communicate with our eyes, we communicate with our touch, we communicate with our smell. There's more and more research about olfactory communication. That's actually huge. In corporate world, it's also the body, it's the tactics. And so when you actually look at the human being, the body has its needs. And the very primary need that a baby that grows up to be a man or a woman that grows up to be an old man has as a body is the need for safety. It's a safety, balance, and protection. And we need that. We crave that, and we're willing to do anything for that. And if you look at any, in my case, genocidal propaganda, the major thing that the perpetrating group was being told is you are being endangered. And so you have to go and protect yourself. And it gets perverted in many ways, but ultimately this is what we need. And the research shows that once the body feels safe, and you look around and it's okay, and in corporate world, it feels, I can do whatever I want. Then it starts exploring, and then it starts getting creative, and then it starts innovating. And Google did very interesting research called Project Aristotle, in which they looked at the perfect team, and they were trying to figure out, who makes a perfect team that we can engineer, and that will, this will be the teams that will be the most creative, the most productive. And it turned out it doesn't have to be PhDs from Stanford. It doesn't have to be engineers from MIT. It was actually a psychological piece that made the teams perfect, and it was called psychological safety. And in psychology, we call psychological safety is that feeling that one can be themselves, one can speak up without feeling ridiculed, that their ideas don't matter, or that they're being stupid. And this is years and years of research coming from Google. And then finally, I'm running out of time. Finally, it's other people. And if any of you study social psychology, you will say that we talk that human beings are social animals. Now, more and more research from neuroscience is coming out and says, not only that we're social, we're actually hyper-social. The self, in some way, we're going back to the basics. The self doesn't even exist. We actually understand the world through our networks. We learn through our networks. We talk about extended self. And if part of our network, if somebody goes away, if somebody gets hurt, somebody turns away from us, we actually experience pain. And it's not a psychological pain, as we all know, because that's it, but it's also physical pain. And so the research, how the nature have designed us as human beings is to overlap the parts of the brain that are responsible for social rejection and social pain with the parts of the brain that are responsible for physical pain. And so finally, in corporate world, we talk about team dynamics, right? How do we relate between each other? Are we tribal, or are we forming a nation? And I think when it comes to social dynamics, one of the most interesting things that a lot of people talk about, few people have cracked so far, is something we call trust equity. We all are interested in equity. This is the ultimate equity that we have between each other as human beings, and it's an equity. It's type of equity we can be sold or bought. It can only be exchanged and can be earned, and that's the trust equity that is. For which we're willing to go places, for which we're willing to rally around, for which we're willing to do a lot of things. And so I'm over time, but the ultimate message I want to leave you with is that in order to hack change, in order to really inspire change, you have to take the entire human being, the entire human OS with you. And that starts with the head, through the heart, through the body, and the social relationships. And that is especially important in corporate and in business world, which means taking the head, the heart, the body, and the social dynamics. And I'll end with this. Thank you.